You. All right, let's get to it. Remember this phrase, no money, no honey. You're laughing. I laughed too when I first heard it when I was about 10 years old. A Vietnamese kid in Saigon listening, eavesdropping really from my schoolyard. Across the fence, there were prostitutes who were talking with American GIs. And that was the only English I remember from all of those years during the Vietnam War because I didn't speak English in Vietnam. And the other line that I remember was, "Me love you long time," which is not exactly a great line to share with your family. But those were the two English sentences I knew until the age of 11. And then the strange thing happened when the country that you know nothing about, whose language you really think is ugly, English was so harsh on your throat, became the place where you end up living as a refugee. Because the war ended, my family and I fled for our lives when communist tanks came into Saigon and ended up in a refugee camp in Guam. And then later on, into another camp in Pendleton in Southern Cal, and then we flew to San Francisco, well, really Daly City, where our refugee life began. And then here I was in the land of milk and honey and no money. Because we were dirt poor. We were so poor that there were 3 refugee families living in Mission Street apartment, in one apartment with about 18 people, 3 bedroom. So people slept everywhere, under the table, over the table, in the living room, in the laundry room, and my American life began. But it began in a strange way because I spoke a little French in school, but I didn't speak English. And again, no money, no honey. That was all I knew when I went to 7th grade in Colma, Daly City, where the kids were tough because it's an immigrant population and working class population. And those were not comeback lines if, they say stuff to you and all you say back is no money, no honey, and me love you long time, which makes you sound like Miss Saigon's little brother. So I didn't know what to say when they started cursing and making fun of me. And all I wanted so much was to learn English, learn it quickly so that I wouldn't be made fun of. Unfortunately, I learned it too quickly. I just changed my name. Within a year, I became from this Vietnamese kid's named Lam Quang Dung to Andrew Lam, right? And I refused to speak Vietnamese altogether. I memorized TV commercials, My baloney has a first name is O-S-C-A-R. My baloney has a second name is M-Y-E-R. And so I memorized these commercials and I would chant them out loud while I'm in this refugee family's household. And to the point where my whole family looked at me like I am some kind of crazy kid. And my mom especially called me the cowboy, the little cowboy. Like, oh, the little cowboy just came home from school. Oh, tell the little cowboy comes to dinner. The little cowboy, tell him, he should speak more Vietnamese in the household. But I just couldn't do it because along with this Vietnameseness was this whole sadness and the trauma of having lost everything and the fights between adults in a very crowded place, and so I blocked it out and I pretended myself an American kid, the cowboy kid. I won't speak Vietnamese, I won't hold on to any of my Vietnamese culture. None of that is related to me. I am Andrew Lam, And I even tell people in school that I'm not Vietnamese, I'm Chinese, or I was American born, I know nothing about Vietnam, so leave me alone. And it was a very strange thing though, because at 7th grade, my voice started to break, and I went from this sweet-sounding kid in Vietnam to this craggy-sounding American kid who spoke English. And my brother said, Mom and Dad told you not to speak so much English in the house, and you refused, and look what happened. You shattered your vocal cord. And I believed him. I had no idea what was happening because my family don't talk about the birds and the bees and definitely not about the honey. So I knew nothing. I knew nothing about it. And I'm like, oh my God, he's right. You know, he's 5 years older, so he has to be right. I'm like, oh wow, you know, but it's such a magical language because speaking French didn't do a damn thing, you know, and then speaking English not only shattered my vocal cord, but all these weird things were happening to me. Tingly things that I can't explain and what's happening. And so for about a few months, I believed that the English language was magical, was extraordinary power over me. And it made me even embrace the language even more because once the vocal cord is shattered, you might as well embrace it because how can you go back? You need to go forward and say, yeah, then forget Vietnam, forget French language. I'm just going to be this American kid. So I read books and books. And then one day, my friend Marvin, wherever you are, thank you, said, do you know what's happening with you? And I said, yeah, my vocal cord shattered because, you know, I spoke too much English. And he said, no, you're going through puberty. And I said, what's that? And he took out, you know, this is before internet, and this is all Wikipedia, and it was called Penthouse magazine. And, and he was showing us exactly what was happening to me. And I'm like, oh my God, so that's where things were happening. And so, but the long story is that I have fallen in love with the English language. I became enchanted, even the reality of puberty settled in, because the language had transformed me literally, physiologically, inside out. But otherwise, I was still a very obedient Vietnamese kid. I went to Lowell High School, which is a nice high school, and then from there I went to Berkeley, and Mama said, little cowboy, you can speak English, but you have to become a doctor. I know you can't speak Vietnamese anymore, but you have to become a doctor for Mama. And I said, okay, Mama, I'll become a doctor. And so I studied biochemistry, you know, and I was in college and I did okay. I did, you know, took biochemistry and other courses. But something along the line of college, and some of you will discover it, is that college is a great place to have sex and fall in love. And so that's exactly what happened to me. Away from family, I found a lot of honey and forgot all about the money. And so I fell in love. And I fell in love with a young man my age. So it was a turn of event that was shocking and amazing and mesmerizing. And I forgot all about schooling. I forgot about med school. I forgot about Mama, you know, wanting me to be a doctor. And I just was really into this zone of love, of romance, of eros. And only after college, and some of you who graduated would know, after college, romance tends to end. And so my heart shattered. And it shattered in such a way that while studying for the MCAT, I would be weeping. You know, the love of my life is gone. You know, I'm abandoned. I need to do something, you know, while studying for the MCAT and working in the cancer research lab at Berkeley, killing mice and collecting their memory tissues and bombarding them with carcinogens, but I don't want to get into that. Anyway, what do I do with this extra time while studying to go to med school? Maybe I'll take UC extension course in creative writing so I can tell the great story of my romance, the great love of my life. I had exactly one. And I'm going to write about this, you know, as a way to grieve my, you know, my romance, my broken heart. And so I took the course and I took to writing, and I really sucked at talking about my romance because I didn't know how to talk about it. Because if your heart is still breaking, if you're still falling, you cannot grasp the trajectory until you hit bottom, right? And so I was still falling. I was still feeling the repercussion of all the meaning of what had happened to me. And there was no way to frame it when you're still falling, still in it. But then I got to one passage, and this passage says something along this line of, if you spend some time with someone, a routine with that someone, a life with that someone, a private language, a private culture, love, and if you lose this person, you lose an entire country. You have in fact become an exile. And then I was reading that phrase and I'm thinking, why are tears falling? Why am I weeping? I have cried about this already, so why am I crying in such a way I hadn't cried before? And it suddenly dawned to me that it was not the first time that my heart broke, that it was the second time. The first time was when that 11-year-old who stood in the refugee camp in Guam, listening to the news of the BBC announcing the end of the war and that South Vietnam was lost, and that all the people he knew, family, relatives, friends, the dogs that he owned, the neighbors, everything he knew was gone. Everything that belonged to the world called Vietnam that I only knew until the age of 11, even the prostitute and no money and no honey laughter was no longer mine. I'm an exile. And that boy had a heart broke, his heart broken, and he hadn't known it. He wasn't aware of it because he was so scared that he ran so far away from that experience that it was the romance and its sadness that opened up a trapdoor to the past. And so I sat down and I wrote. But not about, oh, how sad my life is because the love of my life left me. But I wrote about other broken hearts. I wrote about a broken people, what it is like for refugees to live in crowded apartments, what it is like for some man like my father who was so proud and then robbed of that pride and has to hide in his room. What is it like to watch the news nightly when Walter Cronkite talk about boat people and their boats are sinking in the South China Sea? So I stopped mourning for myself, really, and I started to grieve for people, and the words flowed. They flowed out of me in a way that this self-obsession didn't do well. And I started writing about others who suffer. And I started to create work that was impressing classmates and the teacher. And I kept writing. And then one day, the teacher said, one morning, really, I remember, she said, Andrew, you are not going to medical school. You are going to creative writing school, and I sent your stories to San Francisco State University and the master program there. They loved it. They just say, fill out the applications, and basically you're in. And my first phrase to her was, but Mama is going to kill me. And then I filled out the application, and I got it. And then I started writing more. And I started writing stuff that in graduate school were circulating, and people were sharing it, and it got widened beyond the creative writing program. And what I began to see was that the personal to the historical is a way for those people who had suffered tremendous historical upheavals. It's like rivers and brooks and streams to the sea. You cannot live your life simply mourning your own smallness, but you need to see your life in connection to the larger historical narrative that surrounds you. And this is what saved me from grief. And those writings began to touch other people. And then one day, the writer Richard Rodriguez called me and said, I read your work. Would you like to come and have coffee? And I said, sure. And next thing you know, he gave me books to read, and we became friends. And then the editor of Pacific News Service contacted me and said, would you write something for us? And I say, are you sure? I didn't read the newspaper regularly, but maybe I'll write something. And then I wrote something about what it's like for refugees who live out in stress time, in America, in the Tenderloin in San Francisco. And it went viral. Back then, viral means about 8 papers picked it up. And then I wrote more, and then I was really stoked because I see my name in print, and I get checks sent to my apartment, and I'm, oh my gosh, I'm gonna write more. And then they hired me within a year, and I traveled the world. I went to Hong Kong to cover boat people being repatriated to Vietnam. I wrote about Vietnam, when I went back to my homeland to see the thaw of the Cold War and describe what it's like for a previous country that's under the bamboo curtain finally opened up to the world. And I wrote about that. I went to Cambodia and covered the election under the UN sponsorship. I traveled to Burma, I went to Laos, I traveled the world. So it's an extraordinary thing, when you open up your grief and then you start to have compassion for others and you found a way to share that compassion, it can literally transform your life. And so I kept traveling and I keep winning awards. And every time I win an award, I do this thing. I send it to my parents who live actually in Milpitas, but they recently moved to Fremont. And they would put it on this mantle. So there is this obligatory walk where if you were to visit my parents for the first time, they would make you walk to this mantle where my awards and trophies and plaques and all these things are, and say, these are Andrew Lamb's awards. And then you're supposed to say, ooh. And then they sit you down and pour oolong tea for you. It's interesting because they say my name, Andrew, when they talk to other people because it's an important name. It's the man who became the writer, Although privately my mother say, oh, there is this thing in Vietnamese phrase that you should know. It's that father and mother give birth to children, but God gives them personality. It's her way of saying you cannot control destiny or personal individuals' desire and passion. Well, about 2 years ago, I was at a conference, a writers' conference in New Orleans, and it was called the William Faulkner Word and Music Festival, where I was a judge, and I also was introducing one of my books, I have 3, to the audience there. And I got this email from the first love, the original honey, the one that broke my heart. And he's read my books, and he said, I was a bad person, I didn't know much of what happened, and now I read your work and I have this sense of what had happened for you, and I apologize for, sorry, that sort of thing. And I thought, it's been so long. It's an interesting experience to receive that email because for years I hated him, Talk about me love you long time, well, me loved him long time. And then I also hated him a long time. But then I found my way in the world, So I wrote him back and say, don't apologize, because this morning reading your email to me, I realized that one thing I hadn't realized was that I am in gratitude of you. The heartbreak was what opened the door toward a vocation, a direction in life. You ushered me onto that road. And so don't feel bad, be happy, because I found something more important than money or honey. I found myself. I found a direction in life. Thank you.